It was recently brought to our attention that despite the vast amount of tutorials that we have in our catalog, we actually had nothing for how to retile a floor. To take an old crappy floor and make it brand new, shiny, beautiful, and perfect. So that's what we did. We made a tutorial. Oh, there's Dan.
So you've decided that it's time to tear apart your bathroom floor. But I get it, it's intimidating. You don't know where to start, you don't know where to end. We're gonna show you exactly how to take the old stuff out, put new stuff back in, and be done with it in no time. So stick with us. I'm gonna tear out this tile, take out the baseboard, and then I'll show you what to do after that.
When it comes to removing the floor tiles, depending on how well they're adhered to the floor currently, you might find that just using a hammer and a chisel works fine, or you might need to pull out the big guns. This is an SDS drill. This is a Ryobi one. Should we say that? Does that throw off the algorithm? This is a basic one. It's not an expensive one. But this is a demo hammer. This is a full-sized Makita demo hammer, and this one is great for those really stuck-on tiles or the hard to pry up jobs. Now, what makes these tools special is that they're sort of like mini jackhammers. So an SDS drill, or a slotted drill slot, slotted drive shaft. It's basically a drill that also hammers away at the same time. Not a hammer drill though. There's a distinction there. Either way you slice it, you still have to get everything off that subfloor, whether you chisel it by hand or use a tool. Everything has to come up, and then everything has to get clean, perfectly clean. Once your floor looks like this, there's no more mortar on there, there's no more tile on there, it's time to figure out how bad your floor is, how off level, how wonky it is. And from there, you have to make a determination as to whether or not you can fix it with something like a patching material, or in our case, we needed to self-level the entire floor. As you could probably tell by looking at it, this particular floor was really, really rough, so it needed to be completely redone. And it's important to note that the more effort you spend in this phase, the easier the rest of the tiling process is. So whether you're putting down new cement board or some cases plywood, making sure that your subfloor is flat and smooth is step one into a perfect new floor. So here we are pouring the floor leveling cement, and this is, you'll be surprised how many bags it takes to do even a room of this size. So make sure that you read the bag and you do the calculation properly, because you want to have exactly as much as you need for this process as you're pouring it. You do not have time to recalculate and go to the store and buy another bag once the process starts. For a full, more detailed tutorial of how to self-level a floor, we'll post a link to one of our other tutorials on how to do that, as well as a tutorial on how to do this next step, which is how to lay an uncoupling or a crack isolation membrane. We have a tutorial for that as well. So we'll post both those links, and if you want more detail on those steps, watch those videos. But basically, in a nutshell, what's happening here is we're putting a scratch coat of Thinset down and then adhering a flexible membrane on top of that, which is designed to separate the subfloor and the tile, so that if there is any minor movement, that the tile doesn't crack and the grout doesn't crack. It minimizes cracking. That's basically all you need to know here. But this, again, is another step into ensuring that everything that goes on top of it looks perfect and stays perfect. And we found that this is a very important step in the tiling, the floor tiling process, to make sure that everything you do stays looking perfect. So after we've pre-cut our uncoupling membrane into pieces that fit the space perfectly, we just laid out a thin mortar bed and trowel that out just like you would for laying tile, and then lay your uncoupling membrane into that, checking to make sure that you're getting good adhesion. But this is basically like a practice run into spreading out Thinset for your tiles to adhere to. It's the same process, only this time you're just sticking a mat into it. And then once you do stick the mat down, just make sure that the entire thing is firmly secured to that bed of Thinset. And then you're pretty much ready to lay out your tile. And this step is, again, this is a crucial step into making sure that the tile ends up looking the way you want it to. So we always recommend to do a dry lay, or to lay out your tile and check your layout first before you start putting Thinset on the ground and getting dirty, essentially. Lay your tiles out the way you think they will look best, and see if there's any sliver pieces. So what we mean by that is when you lay your tile out, what you'll see is all those little areas that are going to need cuts. If you're left with anything that's less than a few inches, it tends to look really bad. So sometimes what you can do is lay them all out and see if there's any adjustments that you can make to end up with more full pieces and less tiny little cut pieces. That is how we recommend you get the best bang for your buck when tiling. It also makes it faster and easier. So when it comes to cutting tile, our two favorite options for that are a tile snap, as you're seeing here, and essentially a wet saw. This is a very unique saw. This is an IQ saw, and it's a dry vac wet saw. It cuts like a wet saw, but there's no water. But most people would just use a wet saw here and a grinder. But for the most part, these are the tools you'll need to cut your tile. And since we've already laid out our tile layout ahead of time, it's time to mark and then begin cutting those tiles before we mix our thinset. Now you can cut as you lay your tiles, but we've found that going back and forth between the saw and the thinset tends to let your thinset dry out, and it just basically puts more pressure on the job because you feel like you're racing the clock. If you pre-cut all your tiles, then you're ahead of the game when it comes to laying them. So that's what we recommend doing, and that's what we're doing here. So for the long, straight cuts, it's easiest done on a tile snap. That is, provided the tile you're using can be cut on a tile snap. That's something you should check in advance as well. You can always cut them on a wet saw or with a grinder if the tile snap doesn't work. But the tile snap will save you a ton of time and a ton of mess. So if it is possible, we highly, highly recommend using one of these. This is a fancy schmancy one from all the way from Italy. But again, just because we have the cool tools doesn't mean you need them. It just does make the job a little bit easier. So for those high traffic areas and the high visibility spots like the threshold here, it's worth taking your time and getting those cuts perfect. And that's another reason why it makes sense to do your cuts before you start laying your tile so that you can get them just right, go back and do it again if you have to, just to make sure that those important areas look good. So that's what we're doing here. We're cutting around the door frame and the door casing in this case in order to make our threshold look beautiful. And then once that's done, all those other cuts, they're a breeze, because when you're not making more than one cut to a tile, it really can be as easy as just snapping and moving on. Now when it comes to the toilet flange or a closet flange, there's a few different thoughts on how this should be done. Dan often just cuts a square around it because as long as it's under the toilet, it really doesn't make a difference. But for the sake of this video, I wanted him to show off all his skills. So I made him cut a circle, a perfect circle. And to do that, you just have to find a circle to trace that's approximately the same size as the flange, maybe a little bit bigger just to make sure that you have some wiggle room. But ensure that your hole isn't wider than the base of the toilet, because that's a complete redo and that's a disaster. You don't want that to happen. So once you've marked the center and your circle, take your grinder with a cutting wheel attachment and just very carefully and slowly trace the outline of that circle, angling the grinder just so. It's really hard to describe, but basically keep running that grinder around the circle without going beyond the line until you have a groove. And then from there, what Dan likes to do is to cut out channels on the inside, almost forming it into like a pie or a pizza. And then from there, gently tap those pieces until they fall out. Then you can go back and clean up the outside. Look, there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but basically cut out a circle for the toilet flange and you're done.
Or a square.
Or a square. You can cut a square, I think. There's no reason you can't. At that point, you have all your tiles laid out, cut perfectly, and now it's time to actually tile. So take all your tile up and stack them in a way that is easy for you to remember where they go, because that's the worst thing that can happen here is you forget your order. So pay attention to where you're putting your pieces, and now you're ready to tile. So when it comes to tiling, you can decide to use leveling clips, spacers, or neither. If you really want to just freeball it, that's your prerogative. In this case, we wanted it to be perfectly glassy smooth, so we used leveling clips. And that's basically just a plastic clip that slides under the tile, and then there's a piece that goes on top of it and wedges that tile in against the next one. Again, I'm not going to explain leveling clips to you, but you have options when it comes to spacing and leveling your tiles, so check those out. There's lots of different companies that make different ones. But it's time to tile. So now we're putting our mortar bed down on top of the uncoupling membrane. You may be wondering why this thinset is gray or brown, not white. That's literally just the color of it. This is the bag we had. It's the same stuff, so don't let that throw you. But at this point, and don't eat it. It's bad. It tastes bad. It's bad for you. Don't do that. But what you should always do and always be in the habit of is back buttering your tiles. So not only are you putting your Thinset on the ground and raking it perpendicular to the long side of the tile, so essentially your rake line should go across the tile, you also want to what's called back butter your tile. That means basically apply a full coat of Thinset to the back of the tile and then remove as much of that as you can so there is a layer of Thinset but not a buildup of Thinset. That way when you put your tile down, it bonds. The Thinset on the ground bonds with the Thinset on the tile, and you have a tile that's locked on and it's going to stay that way forever. Another thing that back buttering does is it prevents the tile from sucking the moisture out of the Thinset from underneath. So basically it prevents your Thinset from drying out prematurely and creates a stronger bond. There's lots of reasons why you should back butter. We highly recommend you do it. Put it that way. So now that the tile train has left the station and you are well on your way to your flat floor, if you're choosing to use leveling clips, you're going to want to put the base pieces for those clips in after you lay each tile. So make sure that there's not a buildup of mortar around the piece that you just laid. Dan likes to wipe his finger around the outside before putting those clips in, because if your clips are covered in Thinset, then they sometimes break off in an awkward way. Sometimes they leave little pieces hanging up. So keep your clips clean. Slide each clip in each corner before you lay your next piece, and then that way when the new piece goes on, it goes on top of the clip, then you slide your wedge in and it holds those pieces together and keeps them flush with one another. And that's how you get a flat and level floor. And now for the most important tip that we may give you in this whole video, staying organized and clean while you're tiling. Now that sounds a little counterintuitive, but it will prevent you from panicking and feeling like you're rushing when you're tiling. If you keep clean, you keep your tools clean, you keep the tiles clean, you keep Thinset on the ground and on the back of the tiles and nowhere else, it will allow you to take your time and to get every piece right and to check the pieces that you laid before to make sure that none of them are twisted or there's no lippage. Lippage is basically when one tile sticks out above another one. This is how you make your tile job look professional, because that's how the professionals do it. So keeping a bucket of water and sponge on hand is a great idea. Cleaning the pieces that you've installed, going back and checking to make sure that everything stays clean and organized will change the way that you tile, we promise you. And at that point, it's really just rinse, lather, and repeat. The process is the same for all these pieces, and since you've already done all the tricky cuts, it's as easy as laying each piece over and over, keeping them clean until the job is done. And that last piece, when it goes in, the feeling of joy and jubilation that you get. Well, I'll let Dan, how does it feel?
Pretty good, but I want you to also mention that before you let it dry, double check everything.
That's a good point. So while you still have a chance, make sure that all your pieces are just how you want them before you call it quits for the night. Then when you return and it's cured, it's been 24 or 48 hours or whatever the bag says, it's time to remove your clips. And this part is the best because really all you have to do is kick them or knock them with a mallet and they come flying off, and it is incredibly satisfying. And now it's time to grout. Assuming the floor is clean and there's no Thinset hanging around where there shouldn't be, you're ready to grout. And the most important thing when grouting is to follow the instructions on the grout that you select. But basically all you're going to use is a float, and you're going to pass over each joint, making sure that the grout gets nice and deep into that joint. Scrape as much of it off as you can, let it set up for a bit, wipe it down. Look, each grout is very, very different, so follow the grout instructions on the grout that you select and do that. The process is the same, but each grout is different, so do that. That's the safest way. Dan doesn't like grouting. It's really not so bad. He's just had a few bad experiences. But don't let that spoil you, because when you're grouting, that means you're done. And the floor, which once looked like this, now looks like this. And you've done it. You've created a brand new tile floor right from scratch. Pat yourself on the back because you have created a new floor in a new space, and it's a blank canvas now for you to do whatever you want the rest of the room. But how did you put the wallpaper on? What about baseboards and vanities and toilets? How do you do all that? Listen, this is a floor tiling tutorial. We can't teach you everything.